I want to start by giving you a very brief biography. So as John has already mentioned, I'm an artist working across sculpture, installation and writing. I was born near Gothenburg in Sweden, but now I live and work in West Sussex. And I'm doing a practice-based PhD at UAL, and my title is The Art of the Bodge. I grew up in a very rural setting in Sweden. But several times every year, we would come out of the forest and visit IKEA. I would spend hours browsing the enormous locations, a sprawling array of bendy one-way aisles, brimful baskets and dreamy displays dedicated to homemaking. At Christmases and birthdays, my wish lists included items I'd spotted. And as I visited other houses, I could notice that how homes were assembled purely decorated with the IKEA furniture. That back garden summer houses were a teenager's dream, Nintendos, minty cushions and inflatable sofas. For the final assignment in home economics, the pupils at my school were tasked to select all the furniture, ornaments, utensils and cushioning to put together their first ever home. Of course, this was all imaginary, but cutting and pasting items that we had chosen, we were presenting this alongside a calculation, a budget of how much it would cost. And needless to say, together with scissors and glue, the IKEA catalogue was the only tool provided to us. Away from school, in the summers, there was a group of us that used to go sleep out in the forest. There were places that we knew about by lakes that were particularly beautiful. Sometimes we brought canoes. We cycled for hours along hot and dusty gravel tracks through deep green mossy forests. We lit fires and swam. And thinking back, I see these days and nights in a sort of heady coming of age blur. There was an electric sexual tension in the air. And I remember the panic that cut through that tension when a boy that I know slashed into his foot with an axe. Beautiful sunsets, water pure enough to drink straight from the lake, fear and lust, steam rising, peeing in the pitch black night, water dripping on tarpaulin, it forms a puddle. The woven plastic catches the condensation of breath overnight. It could just as easily suffocate. I moved to the UK in my early 20s, and as John mentioned, I went on to study there. I did my BA and my MA in photography and media art, and I'm doing a practice-based PhD now at UAL. In my work, I weave fictional writing, theory, and sculptural assemblages together in a practice that is rooted in the domestic. It's to do with desire, female sexuality, and violence, I've noticed, is a key point that ties these areas together. Because violence is all too common in women's lives. According to data published by the World Health Organization earlier this year in March, 1/3 of all women across the globe have suffered violence by someone that they're in an intimate relationship with. And this number has been largely unchanged in the last decade. And it's also clear that violence appears across the world. And I'm interested in this as the idea of elsewhere is sort of undermined by the fact that a woman might experience violence wherever she goes in the world. And elsewhere is also mentioned when we speak about violence from another perspective, because we can also often falsely claim that violence against women occurs in other cultures. But this is simply not true when you look at the data. What happens elsewhere also happens here. And from my perspective, there's not some place, some elsewhere where I am truly safe. Yet in my research, the idea of the residency has become really important. And I've come to think of this through the lens of exile, and I'll return to this a bit later on. So I'm interested in the points where these themes, domesticity, sexuality, and so on, break from the ideal. And it might have something to do with my training in photography. because obviously photography works with ideal forms of domestic and family expressions. I'm going through my presentation here, and I'm showing images of my recent work, which gives you an idea of the sort of work I do. I am entering writing up this autumn, so I've just completed my thesis draft, and the ideas here are coming out of my thesis in some ways. So I consider my sculptural work, my theoretical writing, both my thesis. So they're both my thesis, my sculptural work and my theoretical writing. But I also have my creative writing, which is also part of the thesis. So my creative writing is a collection of prose and poetry called Headstone. And during this time in Athens, I've spent time working on that. The central themes to Headstone are desire, sailing, DIY, or as I call it, bodging, and domesticity, and it's driven by moments of sexual interaction. And like in my overall research, some key terms are fragility, aggression, and non-violence. Headstone is a loose and layered narrative. And in Athens, I've been particularly interested in Emily Penrose, and her diary is kept here in the archives. My practice and thinking, as I'm sort of describing, is always multimodal. And I'm using the archival research here as a starting point for my assemblages as well as my writing. And it's a sort of tangential expression of the domestic context of the British school at Athens. So I picked up Emily Penrose's diary. It's from 1887 to 88 when she lived here. She was the oldest daughter of the first ever director at the British School at Athens, and came to live here during the time that her diary covers. So she would have been here in her late 20s, and I'm fascinated to read about what she did when she was here. She had previously studied art, and in her diary, she writes about sketching the Acropolis. So of course, that's what I had to do. And I've left this is a monoprint, and I've left the spelling mistake in facing in because I found it quite funny, but I might change that later date. But yeah, Emily went also in her diary, she writes about going on trips to Pentelli and Delphi. Penrose is really remarkable for her work that she did as a suffragette, kind of working for women to be able to gain university degrees. But as I read her diary, which is describing these everyday things that she did, the sketching and going to tea, going to church, I'm wondering, who is she writing for? And I suppose she might have not, at the time of writing, expected her diary to be read at all. You know, diaries are private. Or maybe she did expect her diary to be read and therefore presented herself as someone that she wanted us to think that she was in her diary. A version of herself that is acceptable. So I'm asking Emily Penrose, who are you? Who do you want me to think you are? But also, who will you allow me to make you? How will you allow me to understand you? Object-oriented feminism, or OOF, promotes taking multiple, sometimes contradictory perspectives as opposed to didactic, singular viewpoints. The idea is to allow for many voices to be heard. And in my writing in Headstone, I'm self-consciously questioning myself. I'm going out on a limb, I'm tracking back and changing my mind, and this is how I work in Headstone and in my thesis writing overall. The writing becomes, in a sense, a thinking. The residency here in Athens follows on from, as John mentioned, previous residences in Italy and France. And it follows on a narrative that has been present in my research since 2019. So the work here connects to previous residencies, and throughout the narrative in Headstone, I've been inspired by historical figures and adapted their history for my narrative. One central figure in my writing is Julia, whose father was Emperor Augustus. Julia spent 7 years in exile on Ventotene. It's a remote island, well, it was then a remote island in the Tyrrhenian Sea, where she was sent by her father to punish her promiscuous behavior. And in this project, exile has become synonymous with the desire to have a practice position outside or away from something or someone. I've come to understand exile as an act of displacement that offers the opportunity to imagine new possibilities. And in the context of exile, I'm looking for non-violence, where violence is just a fuel for creativity. The works might be aggressive, but I'm looking for non-violence. And it's a process that doesn't meet violence with more violence, but makes it into something else. So Julia was accused of adultery. Though the motivations around her exiles are contested and probably were politically motivated, Julia was made an example of Augustus's conservative politics. In 18 BC, he legislated in Lex Julia to, amongst many things, make adultery a crime punishable with being exiled to an island. It is probable that the narrative around Julia's exile has been distorted, but the contemporary reports claim that Julia had scoured the city at night, chosen the forum itself as a platform for the said liaison, and that's the same place that her father had announced Lex Julia from some years before. So Julia was punished, accused of cheating and leading a debauched life, and this is an account of her character that is generally accepted by scholars. Following the accusations of promiscuity, she was exiled to Ventotene without a trial for crimes, quote, injurious to religion and the violation of His Majesty. So today, Casa Julia, where she stayed, is an inconspicuous and little visited site locked behind a rusty and bent metal fence on Ventotene's northern tip. It looks to me to be a forgotten ruin, and it's completely exposed to the elements. So Augustus's law enforcement was an attempt to raise the moral standards of the time. He aimed at protecting marriage and favoring the family and appealed to conservatism, invoking morals of the past. While his political efforts were meant to recreate a rigor of previous times, according to Foucault, who's written on this, the lived reality was different. The legislative intentions were too sporadic to have any broad societal impact. Yet Foucault argues that the time of Augustus marks the start of a movement that sees increased focus placed on the individual. It's urging citizens to be more austere unless they want to live like the throngs. So Foucault places any change in sexual behavior, decreased public promiscuity, and so on around this time on the anxieties of the individual to do right and exercise self-respect. So for Foucault, this is the beginning of the development over centuries where sexual freedoms are limited through the individual's relationship with laws and institutions. This individualism or care of the self through self-reflection and discipline sees the individual emerge as an ethical subject. So the centralizing of the self sees a withdrawal into the domestic when marriage and sexuality become central to the acts of self-care. It is a move from the provocative sexuality of ancient Greek towards that of the austere morals of Christianity, prioritizing the nuclear family over a sexuality outside of that. So the patriarch's behavior is central to this understanding, as the control of his own urges reflects on his standing as a moral subject within society. So if he's able to exert power, control his own urges, he is then able to exert power over others as a result of this. So gendering and placing the creation of masculine power within the domestic and in relation to the nuclear family, I ask, where is the woman's sexuality? So if we use Julia to try and understand this, then the answer is exiled on a windy island, geographically outside of the moral codes of the city, and any ordinary domesticity where power is created. She is used by the patriarch to give himself power, but once she's been spent, so to speak, she is at least geographically outside of its force field. But is it not on the outside of this force field that one wants to be? Maybe that is where we can find a genuine elsewhere. Maybe this is the place, maybe this place, it could be an island away from the context of the continent. And Deleuze speaks about this. He speaks about the island as a territory free from the norms and ideals of the mainland, the continent. So maybe this is a place to make art from. It might be a residency, or it might be the loft on the border of the home. And the studio here in Athens is the loft, the top of the director's house. So what do we do on this outside? How do we use this space, this opportunity to be separate? This is, in a sense, the central question in my research. And I want to talk a little bit more about Ventotene, because it's also important later on in the 18th century, prostitutes and criminals were sent here to repent their immoral behaviors, as it was believed at the time that spending time in unspoiled nature would realign one's moral compass. But is the nature in Ventotene unspoiled? What they did was set up new frontiers, and they opened brothels in the sandstone caves immediately below where Julia had lived many hundred years before. Which, when I visited Ventotene in 2019, had sail repair shops in them. The writing in headstone and in my thesis overall articulates the experience of inhabiting a female body, embedding and validating the experiences of women in the middle of violence. It's easy to liken the practice-based research to a journey. I've sailed to Ventotene, and now I'm in Athens, and the plot of headstones follows a journey on a sailing boat, starting on the north coast of France via Ventotene through the Greek archipelago, where Emily Penrose spent some time. Similarly to the writing, my sculpture work responds to this idea of violence as well, and kind of rebuilds the domestic narratives and environments. And I want to give a very brief glimpse now of some of the ideas that feature around my sculpture and drawing practice in this context of Athens. So I'm thinking about the concealment, revelation idea that I have from Emily's diary. What is she telling? What is she not telling? But also about the fragility and the support structures I can see around some of the ancient monuments in the city. And it's what I've sketched visiting some of the places that Emily mentions in her diary. So this is the temple of Zeus with its scaffolding around it. While, according to Judith Butler, we exist within the force field of violence, in the book, The Force of Nonviolence from 2020, she also claims that we are free to pick up the tool to respond to violence or not. So while this research starts with violence, I don't think it's destined to stay violent. In The Force of Nonviolence, Judith Butler discusses approaching equality through non-violent forms of resistance. So non-violence is, according to Judith Butler, not a state of passivity, nor is it an action built on a radiating love towards a generalized other. We are capable of aggression, and Butler sees this as a fundamental ability in all humans. With aggression and even rage present in our psychology, Butler's nonviolence is about challenging those states in a way that refuses to produce violence, making the case against violence. Sort of Judith Butler plays devil's advocate, and she says, quote, "One of the strongest arguments for the use of violence is that it's tactically necessary in order to defeat structural or systemic violence." But she explains, because violence relies on subjective understanding, if used, violence always has the capability of behaving in unpredicted ways. So it can easily get out of hand. But boiling it down to a very simple separation, when faced with the option of living in a world with violence or a world without it, do we not all want to live in a world without violence? For me, in this research and on this residency, violence represents oppressive behaviors that I do not wish to recycle. But working within the terms of the present, quoting Butler again, she states that dealing with violence isn't a choice per se, because we're already in its force field. What we face instead is the choice to whether to pick up the tool of violence or not. And if we pick up the tool of violence, we're contributing to building a more violent world. Still, aggression and non-violence are bound. And this is the case in my research, as my work is staging a protest while maintaining a level of aggression. So for Butler, non-violent forms of resistance can and must be violently pursued. And I understand this similarly to how Foucault understands that power always produces resistance. Where there is power, Foucault says, quote, "Where there's power, there is resistance." So throughout this research, I've thought of violence as a continuously present threat and reality, something I can't feasibly get away from. Moreover, I have thought of it as an agent shaping my subjective understanding of the institution, of domesticity, and sexuality. And this understanding is underpinning my creation of knowledge, as it were. And it's become a core methodological tool in my research. And I've still got this picture up because I wanted to talk a bit about support. So Judith Butler claims that we're all supported. So the sidewalk carries us every day to where we need to go. Our food is brought to us by a supply chain of producers. We share an emotional life with the people around us. And in research, we use others to position ourselves. But I've come to make works that wobble, that hardly stand up. And I've found that I'm holding on to that precarity, that fearing of collapsing. And in the book, Not Knowing How Artists Think, from 2013, Emma Cocker asserts that artists looking for an unknown are, quote, adopting tactical approaches or methods that produce the condition of uncertainty or disorientation. So in this research, this precarity that I'm looking for, that I'm looking to keep, has been achieved by, for instance, spending time at a residency outside of your sort of normal comforts and domestic environments. But it's also within leaving the works to wobble, to be precariously supported. Because the woman's body neither is ever completely safe. She might at best be able to keep herself protected in her domestic environment, but as the setting of her body and context changes, you know, she goes from the park to a friend's house to a restaurant, so too does her concern for safety. There is also an awkwardness about this impeding fall of the sculptural works that I make. And Emma Cocker again states that working with the methodology of the unknown, the artwork, quote, involves an attempt to smuggle a trace of something infinitely unknowable within the parameters of finite form. And I found that me and my works behave similarly. We sway, but we're also unable to resist provoking. We seem to be coupled together from an array of past experiences or materials. I find the materials for my sculpture works kind of from the bits that are just left lying around. So within this aggressive yet vulnerable state, me and the sculptures are companions. So I'm seeing the sculptural body as analogous with my body. And as previously mentioned, Butler discusses becoming an obstacle. She's talking, quote, about using the solidity of the body to block or derail further exercise of violence. And she's talking, of course, about non-violent forms of protest where the body is used to stop violence. But I leave the sculptural bodies to perform this protest in my absence. But I have to ask myself, at what points does the fragility of the sculpture become violent? There is perhaps a tipping point when the body commits new injustices, causing harm, for instance, to another artwork. What if one of my works fell over or collapsed during a speech? So beyond protest, aggression and violence, I've also come to understand that the fragility of the sculpture bodies reveal a vulnerability and an awkwardness. So it's a protest, I'm protesting, but I'm also being exposed. And a sense of the artworks being cobbled together. So this idea that I'm talking about has become synonymous with the lack of balance and propping up. And I've come to use the term bodging to describe this slippage between the fragile, the aggressive, the standing and the collapsed, the pronounced and the unspeakable, the messy and the ordered. So as I leave my sculptural work, for instance, in a gallery setting, I carry a dull worry that they will fall over. And when using this lens to look at the column of Zeus Temple, for instance, completely encapsulated in scaffolding, I see support. I see cooperation between the current steel and the historical carved stones. They seem to be there for one another. But infuriatingly, the scaffolding completely obscures the view of the column. We can hardly see it. And I'd be interested in knowing more about this. Maybe someone that has joined us here has more knowledge about this. Is the scaffolding providing structural support, or is it simply there for a way, as a way to access the column? So finally then, the bodging is a methodology for ensuring that the works stand up. In the practice, this is a very real approach, as once they do stand up, they're complete. The standing up is important as it reveals something about my ability to work in this field, about my ability to carry out research. To bodge a sculpture is an entirely liberating activity that is instantaneous and blunt. It's driven by a need to find a solution. Just make it stand. The approach in this research has been to embrace the messiness and acknowledge that something can be right even if it's wrong. I've come to understand the willful imbalance and expert-handedness, which can be understood as a sort of feminist, sexually charged bodging, engaging with the creating of subjectivity through sexual memories that are unclear. It's the blending of violence and pleasure. The process of making in a bodge way is immediate, direct, it's unfussy. relying on intuition. The bodge is instant. It's spontaneous in a way. And because of the urgency of the situation that requires a bodge in the traditional sense, the methodology is guided by what's within grasp. So ultimately, what I'm suggesting with this is an unwillingness to cooperate or exist within the creation of domestic power and ideals that do not fully serve to create the subjectivities I'm seeking to define. So in other words, I'm rearranging the space to manifest my experience. And thank you. Yes, I've just left a little list there of some of the, well, all of the titles I've mentioned, if anyone's particularly interested in anything there.